Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review and rank all three Back to the Future movies and to explain what I think was better or worse in all the movies. And originally I was just going to make a long video just talking about the mechanics of the time traveling in these movies and discuss a few illogical things and try to come up with excuses and explanations and theories to try to make it all work, and I drew it all the timelines to try to explain everything, and it got really messy by the end, and I think it's going to be a really funny video. But before I sat down to edit it, I told myself, you have to collect a few pictures from the movies to show people exactly what you're talking about, because I'm going into extreme details and all of that, and not everyone might remember it. And then I told myself I'm just going to skim through the movies just to collect the pics I need, but then I ended up watching all three movies again for the 100th time probably. And actually I did notice a few little details that I never noticed before, and that's one of the signs of a really brilliant movie, when it has so much richness of detail that every time you rewatch it you might notice something new. And this time I noticed how in the second movie Doc is wearing a shirt that, if you look closely, it has the train and the people on the horses chasing that train, which is what happened in the end of the third movie. So that's really funny foreshadowing. And I also want to rank these movies and to explain why my ranking changed, because in the past, when I was a kid, I actually loved the second movie more than the first one. I thought the second movie is better, and I'm going to explain why. And I still think that movie has some very interesting science fiction things which might be even better than the first movie, but as a movie overall I do think the first one is better, because the second movie had a lot of flaws which the first movie didn't have. The first movie is basically a perfect movie in every way. The acting is excellent by everyone. It also has Crispin Glover, which wasn't in the other movies, and so that's a huge plus. He was probably the funniest character in the whole movie. And it's the most original movies, because one of the problems in the sequels is that they're basically remaking the same things again and again. The same kind of scenes happen again and again, and it's kind of comedic. It's like a self-parody, so it is kind of funny in a way. But still, the first one felt so original and so unexpected, because it's the first time you see something like this, and yet the other ones kind of simply recycled a lot of the same things. And most importantly, the first movie had an emotional payoff in the end, because they have that whole love story set up of Lorraine and George having to hook up together so that Marty will not disappear, and so he tries to hook them up together. And in the end, that scene when George and Lorraine are dancing and they're about to kiss, and Marty is disappearing because George still hasn't fully decided, I guess, to man up and to be with Lorraine, and so Marty is disappearing, and then suddenly George kisses her. And it's all done with that music, and they show us the picture of all his siblings appearing back in the picture, indicating that the timeline is restored and that their kids get born. And so that works so well emotionally. That scene gives me goosebumps, because there was such a setup for it. You were rooting for it so much, and then it finally happens and it hits you with that music and everything at once. And I think it's one of the most emotional scenes I ever saw, and there was nothing like that in the second movie. And the character of George was so funny across the movie, and sadly that actor was not in the sequels. They actually had some guy play him, and they put makeup of him to make him look like the original George, and Glover actually sued them for that because they didn't have a right to do it. They didn't pay him, they didn't ask his permission, and so there's a whole scandal behind the scenes with all of that. And so I think that's also one of the biggest things that are better in the first movie, the fact that it has Glover as such a funny character. And another big problem in the second movie is how they misused or underused the character of Jennifer, Marty's girlfriend, because they brought her to the future, but then the movie didn't know what to do with her, and then they simply put her to sleep and then treated her like a suitcase rather than a character. They just carried her around from place to place and eventually left her in the evil alternate timeline and just left her there and went back in time. And I'll discuss all the mechanics of that in that other video that I promise you is going to be really funny. Going to discuss the actual mechanics and logic of all the stuff. But in terms of the movie itself, like, what a waste of opportunity. You have this character who you can use and develop, and you just simply treat her as a suitcase and almost don't do anything with her. And so that's a big problem of that movie, I think. And also a lot of other stuff in that movie didn't really age really well. That future scene, everything they show us in the future, is something I loved in this movie, and that's actually one of the reasons I considered it the best movie, because back then when I watched it as a kid, that was so amazing. To me, it was better than anything in the first movie because, in the first movie they go into the past and it might be interesting for nostalgia and all of that, but I didn't really care about that back then. And yet in the second movie they show us the future, and it's such an amazing, cool future with hoverboards and with flying cars and all that stuff they showed us in the future. Was really enjoyable to me as a science fiction fan, and so that's one of the things I used to love in the second movie. And yet looking back at it now, obviously a lot of that stuff didn't age well. Obviously the special effects don't really look that amazing anymore, and the predictions obviously didn't come true, and so it's a little bit silly now, and so it makes that movie feel really dated, unlike the original movie, which is a classic, which is timeless. It will always be a good movie. And yet the second movie kind of became silly with time because their predictions didn't come true and the special effects look kind of iffy, and so a lot of silly stuff, which is still fun. It's still comedic and fun, but it's not as timeless, it's not as amazing as it used to be. And another thing which I always loved in the second movie, and I still really love it, is the whole time travel plot itself, which I think is more interesting than in the first movie, because the first movie was basically a simple classic time travel story of someone going into the past, interrupting the past and having to fix it. So it's kind of simplistic. I'm not saying that makes it a bad movie, but it's kind of simplistic to me as a hardcore science fiction fan. I enjoy the more convoluted story of the second movie because, in the second one they go into the future, then they go into the past, they accidentally create an alternate timeline, then they have to go even further back into the past. And the most brilliant part of the movie is how they go back to the same time of the first movie and they see all the same events from the side. So there's like multiple time loops happening at once, and there's the danger of causing paradoxes, the way that Marty bumps into those friends of Beef, and then they want to attack his previous self, the one who was from the first movie, and then he knows that if they stop him, they delay him, and then he will be late to go back into the future as happened in the first movie. Then that will be a huge major paradox because then he cannot be here now, then everything they did will get even more messed up. And so that was such a mind-bending, convoluted stuff that it was fascinating to me as a kid, and even now I think that part of the movie is brilliant, the way that it's like multiple copies of the same person created by the time traveling, and I almost wish it would be even more convoluted. And I think there are some logical mistakes in this movie. I will cover that in my next video, and especially with Jennifer, the fact that they left her in that other timeline simply assuming that she'll be okay when they fix it, and so shouldn't there be multiple copies of her in the end? And technically when they jump to the future in the beginning of the movie, then they shouldn't have been in the future. The older Marty and Jennifer shouldn't have been there if they jumped there, and so that's kind of a mistake, and I'm going to offer all kinds of theories to try to explain it. Basically multiple timelines, multiple copies of the same character, and so it's even more convoluted than you think. But what I liked in the second movie is that part when they showed two Martys, one Marty watching the previous Marty from the previous movie and trying to save him without his knowledge, and all of that stuff was really funny and brilliant. And all the stuff in the alternate timeline was really fun, this whole idea of the alternate timeline. So the second movie has much more fascinating ideas in terms of pure science fiction and the time travel story. I think in that category the second movie might be more interesting. However, because there are all kinds of logical problems which I am going to discuss, and just a quick example, how did Beef go back to the original future to give them back the time machine if he already created a separate timeline? How did he come back to the original one? So all kinds of illogical things like that, and so that makes me take a few points down from the brilliance of the convoluted stuff, which is still really interesting, but it's not perfect, and therefore I don't think it's as good as the first movie, which is still to this day a nearly perfect film, and it exploits all the characters it has in the movie in the best way possible, and doesn't just do silly stuff just for the sake of it. Everything in that movie serves the story. There are no silly scenes just for the sake of it. Everything is connected and serves a purpose, and there's that emotional payoff in the end of the movie, and the love story in the movie. Everything works much better in the first movie, so the first movie is a better movie overall, but I still think some of the science fiction stuff in the second movie is actually more interesting. And as for the third movie, I think it's an excellent movie and I love it a lot, but it's slightly less appealing to me to rewatch it. It has less rewatchability, maybe because it's kind of slower paced, it's kind of more relaxed. It's still a very fun movie, but it doesn't have as much stuff crammed into it. And so there's not a lot of stuff that I would want to rewatch again and to notice every little detail. And so it's kind of less jam full packed of ideas. So overall, it's slightly less good, especially since I'm not a huge fan of Wild West movies and all of that. And so I appreciate this movie a lot. I see all the production value and all of that. Really good movie, but slightly less good for my personal taste. And it also has a few logical problems with it, and some of them are simply meant to be comedic, and so I guess it's okay. It's kind of the movie making a self-parody, you know, all the same actors play different characters in every movie. In the second one it was the same actor, Tom Wilson, who played not just Beef but also his own grandson, and Michael J. Fox played not just his older self but also all of his own children, you know, his son and his daughter is played by him, and so that's a little bit kind of maybe too silly. But since it's all a comedy movie, I guess I'm okay with that. But in the third movie, we have characters a century earlier and still played by the same actors. And so that's kind of like a running gag, the same kind of joke, that all the ancestors look exactly like their great-great-grandchildren. And so that's kind of part of the comedy, and the way that it's been repetitive is kind of funny. You know, McFly goes into that bar, and then again you have Beef showing up and saying, "Hey McFly, I told you never to show your face around here." And so that's kind of repetitive humor, which I do find funny. On the other hand, the way that all the same actors play different roles again makes it a little bit too silly. It simply kind of loses realism, especially since the wife of the McFly in the third movie, the one who is the great-great-great-grandfather of Marty, is married to a woman called Maggie, who is played by the same actress who played Lorraine, and yet this is the McFly family. So this is from the side of his father, the side who produced George, who later married Lorraine. So how come one of the ancestors of George looks exactly like Lorraine? Makes no sense unless they were cousins or something, which makes it all, you know, a little bit awkward. And so maybe they should have simply said that's the family of Lorraine's side, that it all came down from Lorraine, and then it will make more sense why some of the ancestors look like Lorraine and some of them look like Marty, if it's all from the side of Lorraine. And yet they said it's the McFly family, so that means they all produced George. So how come there was one who looked exactly like Lorraine from George's side? That makes no sense. And I guess they just really wanted to have that actress in the movie, and that's okay, she's a great actress, but maybe they should have simply said that's her side of the family. But then I guess they wouldn't be able to have that scene of Tannen entering the bar and saying, "Hey McFly," so that wouldn't work anymore, so I guess they couldn't do that. So anyway, there's all kinds of logical flaws like that, which I think could have been fixed with slightly better writing, could have fixed all of these issues. And there's another logical problem of how come Doc doesn't remember exactly what happened with his younger self, because remember, the younger self of Doc helped out Marty again back in 55 after he sent the first Marty from the first movie Back to the Future. Suddenly a second Marty showed up, and then he helped him jump to the past to save himself from the future who got stuck in the past. And so shouldn't the one in the past now remember everything that happened to his younger self? And yet he doesn't seem to remember that. He asks Marty, "Who's the idiot who gave you this costume?" And then he says, "You did." So that means he didn't remember. We can explain it away by saying it's a different timeline Doc who doesn't remember everything that happened, because that was a change that happened. So that's why he doesn't remember. Maybe he will remember it later as the ripple effect will catch up to him. Maybe suddenly he will start to remember exactly what happened previously, but at this moment he still doesn't remember it because he's kind of insulated from the changes of the timeline, because he came from a different timeline in which that didn't happen. So we have all kinds of little illogical things, which I think, again, with slightly better writing, they could have worked that in and made it funnier and better and more logical. And I think there were some missed opportunities in this movie. For example, how come Doc thinks it's okay for him to live in the past and to possibly affect the future? Doesn't he know about, the butterfly effect? Him doing even little changes in the past might have catastrophic results, and yet when it comes to figuring out what to do with the woman of his dreams, he decides to leave her, even though he knows that she was supposed to die in the original timeline, and he saved her. And so it would make perfect sense for him to simply decide right away that they should take her to the future to avoid creating paradoxes and all of that, and yet they don't even consider it, and it just happens by luck, by coincidence. That's exactly how it ends. And so I wish they would have added some more science fiction-y time traveling convolutedness to the movie that would make it more interesting, and yet they kind of treat it all as if it's no big deal anymore. They're kind of used to time travel by now, and they're not worried about the consequences anymore. And they don't discuss what to do with Tannen, for example, because Marty thinks about facing him off in a shootout. So shouldn't they discuss the potential of creating a paradox, because if he kills Tannen, then he might affect the future? And they didn't even ask the question, does Tannen already have kids or not, because if he didn't yet produce children and they kill him or get him arrested, they might erase B from existence, and you might think that's not a bad thing, but that will affect the entire future of everyone, and so Marty might again not ever be born, and so on. So they don't even raise any of these topics for discussion, and I think that's a missed opportunity. And so the movie feels a lot simpler, a lot less tenseful, a lot less interesting as it could have been if they did exploit the full potential of the situation, as they did in the second movie. Because in the second movie the stakes were so high because there was a line when Doc said that if they create a paradox, they risk destroying the entire universe, because the space-time continuum might unravel itself and it will create destruction in the whole universe. And then Marty is kind of shocked, and then Doc says, that's actually the worst case scenario. Maybe the destruction will be localized. Maybe it will only destroy our own galaxy and not the whole universe. And then Marty kind of thinks for a moment and says, well, that's a relief. And that's one of the funniest moments in the whole movie. And it also creates the stakes, even later in the movie when Marty worries about what might happen if he disrupts the events that happened in the first movie. And then Doc says, we'll have a major paradox on our hands. And then Marty says, one of those things that can destroy the universe. And Doc says, yes. And so the stakes are so amazingly high in that movie that it makes it all much more excited. And yet in the third movie they don't care about anything anymore, so they can change the past, they don't care. And then when they come back to the future, except for that canyon being renamed Eastwood, because I guess people knew that he fell down with the train there, and so they assumed he died there, and so except for that nothing else changed at all. And it seems to be the exact same timeline as in the end of the first movie. And Jennifer just wakes up on that porch, even though they left her there in a totally different timeline. So how is she there exactly? Shouldn't there be another Jennifer there? So all these technical issues and the illogical stuff with the time traveling, I will discuss in detail in my next video, which I promise you is going to be really funny, with diagrams that I drew and everything, and I'm going to try to explain it somehow, and it's going to create a real funny mess with all the convolutedness of it. So that's going to be really funny. So I first wanted to make this video just as a quick review of all of these movies and to say my personal ranking of it. So I do think the first movie is the best one as a movie, but the second one is second best, and it has a few things which makes it more interesting in a science fiction way. And the third movie is still a very good movie, but it also has more flaws than the other ones. But overall it's still one of the best trilogies of all time. Really fun movies, probably at the top of my list of favorite movies. And in my next video I'm going to analyze all the mechanics of the time traveling and the paradoxes and the time loops and the timelines, and all of that is going to be such a lovely mess to discuss and analyze and theorize. And so that's going to be a very fun video coming up next. So let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.